The year was 2189. Earth had been a member of the Galactic Concord for only 11 years. To the older races of the galaxy, 11 years was nothing. It was barely enough time to learn the names of the stars in a single system. Humans were new. Humans were small. And in the eyes of most alien civilizations, humans were not a threat worth thinking about. The Galactic Concord was made up of more than 200 civilizations. Some of them had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. They had built empires, fought wars, and made peace long before the first human ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. When Earth finally joined the Concord, the older races gave humanity a small seat at the council table and went back to their own business. Nobody paid much attention to the new arrivals. The Vorkai Empire was one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. They were tall, cold-blooded reptilian beings who had built their empire over 6,000 years. They did not make decisions based on feelings. They made decisions based on numbers, resources, strength, profit. To the Vorkai, everything in the universe was a calculation. And in their calculation, humans were simply not important. What the Vorkai did care about were the 3 human colony worlds sitting along the edge of the Dreven cluster, a region rich in rare minerals and lying on one of the most important trade routes in the sector. Kepler-7 had been settled by humans for 40 years. New Carthage was a growing farming world with a population of nearly 2 million. Dreven's Rest was a mining hub, full of workers and their families, who dug deep into the rock every day and sent resources back to Earth and her other colonies. The Vorkai looked at these 3 worlds. They ran their numbers, and they decided to take them. It was not a declaration of war. The Vorkai did not see it as one. To them, it was a removal, a small, clean, logical operation. They sent 3 of their battle fleets, 1 for each world, and they hit all 3 at the same time, so there would be no warning and no chance for escape. The attacks lasted less than 48 hours. When it was over, 4,700,000 humans were dead. The Vorkai sent a short message to the Galactic Council explaining what they had done. They called it a territorial correction. They said the human colonies had been sitting on Vorkai-claimed space, which was not entirely true, but they said it with complete confidence because they believed no one would challenge them. Certainly not Earth. The Galactic Council went into emergency session the very next day. Representatives from dozens of civilizations crowded into the Great Chamber on the neutral station of Velhora Prime. They spoke for many hours. Some were angry, some were nervous. Most of them wanted to avoid a larger conflict. The general feeling in the room was that humanity should be offered something, perhaps a formal apology, perhaps some financial payment, and then the matter should be considered closed. One of the oldest council members, a tall, silver-skinned being called Ambassador Yireth of the Yelthari civilization, watched the debate with quiet eyes. He had been an observer of the galaxy for a very long time. He had seen many conflicts. He had seen many empires do what the Vorkai had just done. And he had seen many smaller, weaker civilizations accept the loss and move on, because they had no other choice. He looked across the chamber to where the human delegation sat. There were only 3 of them. At the center was Admiral Sarah Voss, who had left the military 10 years ago to become Earth's senior diplomat. She was a woman of around 60, with short gray hair and calm, dark eyes. She had said nothing since the session began. She sat with her hands folded on the table and listened to everyone speak. Several council members turned to her and asked carefully what Earth intended to do. They used gentle words. They talked about restraint. They talked about the long history of peaceful resolution within the Concord. One of them quietly suggested that perhaps Earth should consider the reparations offer the Vorkai were prepared to make. Sarah Voss looked at them, one by one. Then she looked at the Vorkai representative, a thin, pale creature named Commander Zelvreth, who was watching her with the flat, patient eyes of something that had never once felt afraid. She said nothing. She closed her folder. She stood up. She nodded once to her 2 colleagues, and the three of them walked out of the council chamber. Nobody stopped them. Nobody quite knew what to make of it. Most of the council assumed Earth was retreating, going home to grieve, to accept the reality of what had happened. Commander Zelvreth watched them go and felt nothing at all. The Vorkai had run the numbers many times. Earth had a small fleet. Their ships were slow and only lightly armed compared to the great warships of the older civilizations. They had no real combat experience in space. They were new, they were emotional, and they were alone. No other civilization in the Concord would go to war over a species that had only been in space for a century. The math was simple. Earth could not fight back. For 72 hours, there was complete silence from Earth. No messages, no transmissions, no public statements. The galaxy watched and waited, and most of them began to assume the silence meant surrender. Then, on the morning of the third day, a single transmission came through on every open communication channel in the Concord simultaneously. It was short. It carried Earth's military seal, and it said only this: "We will not be sending diplomats." In the council chamber, the room went very quiet. Ambassador Yireth of the Yelthari looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at Commander Zelvreth. The Vorkai's expression had not changed. He still looked calm, still looked certain. But Yireth had been watching civilizations for a long time, and something in the back of his ancient mind whispered to him that the Vorkai had just made the most expensive miscalculation in their 6,000-year history. Nobody listened to that whisper. Nobody in the galaxy quite understood what happened next. They had expected Earth to go quiet, maybe to protest, maybe to send another diplomatic team to the council and ask for a formal hearing. That was what smaller civilizations did. That was what the math suggested. That was what made sense. But Earth was not doing what the math suggested. Within 6 hours of the final transmission, every orbital shipyard above Earth and her surviving colonies lit up at once. The energy output was visible to long-range sensors across 3 star systems. Ships that had been sitting in civilian registration, cargo haulers, research vessels, transport ships, began broadcasting military codes. Docking bays that intelligence reports had listed as inactive were suddenly full of activity. A Vorkai intelligence officer named Subcommander Vekis was the first one to begin asking questions. He had been assigned to watch Earth's communications for any sign of military movement. What he saw confused him deeply. He ran his analysis 3 times before sending it to his superiors. The report said that Earth appeared to be mobilizing a war fleet. A very large war fleet. One that, according to his estimates, had apparently existed for quite some time without ever appearing in any of their intelligence records. His superiors did not believe him. They told him he had made an error. Earth's military was small and underdeveloped. The Concord's own reports confirmed it. Humanity had been in space for barely a century. They could not possibly have built something like what Vekis was describing. Vekis sent the report again, this time with more detail. What the Vorkai did not know, what almost nobody in the galaxy knew, was that humans had a very particular kind of psychology. They were by nature a species that prepared for the worst. Thousands of years of difficult history on their own planet had given them a deep, almost instinctive need to be ready. While their public-facing military had indeed been modest, their government had quietly been building a second fleet for decades. It was registered under civilian construction codes. It was funded through dozens of different budget lines buried in infrastructure reports. Alien analysts who studied Earth's behavior had noted this tendency and called it, somewhat dismissively, irrational anxiety preparedness, a quirk of human psychology with no real practical value. They had been wrong. On the 4th day after the attack on the colonies, Earth's War Command officially activated what they called the Soul Armada. 14,000 warships, 3 million active soldiers, weapons platforms that had never once appeared in any Concord intelligence file. The fleet was not new. It had been built piece by piece over 40 years, in secret, by a species that had learned the hard way that the universe was not always kind, and that being unprepared was the same thing as being helpless. The news spread across the galaxy in hours. In the council chamber on Velhora Prime, delegates from a dozen civilizations pulled up the sensor data and stared at it in silence. The numbers did not make sense to them. Earth was supposed to be a minor power. Earth was supposed to be manageable. Earth was not supposed to have 14,000 warships and enough firepower to challenge the greatest empires in the sector. But before the fleet moved, Earth did something else, something that the galaxy would talk about for a very long time. They broadcast a message, not to the Vorkai, not to the Council, to every inhabited system in the Concord, on every frequency at the same time. The message was not a speech. It was not a list of demands. It was not a declaration of war. It was a reading. A human voice, calm, steady, unhurried, began to speak names. Just names, one after another. The name of every man, woman, and child who had died in the attacks on Kepler 7, New Carthage, and Dreven's Rest. 4,700,000 names, each one spoken clearly, each one given its own moment. It took 11 hours and 23 minutes to read them all. The broadcast played on repeat for an additional 24 hours. Across the galaxy, in ships and space stations, and on the surfaces of alien worlds, beings of all kinds heard those names. Some turned off the channel immediately. Others listened for a while before moving on. But a great number of them, far more than Earth probably expected, stayed with it. They listened to the whole thing, or most of it, in silence. Something about it reached past logic and past politics, and landed in a place that was much harder to explain. On the Vorkai homeworld of Vor Prime, the broadcast was officially labeled as psychological theater. The High Command watched their numbers. Earth's fleet was large, yes, larger than expected. But the Vorkai had been fighting wars for 6,000 years. They had faced enemies far older and far more experienced than a civilization that had barely left its own solar system within living memory. They had weapons that could crack a moon. They had battle tactics refined over centuries. They had fought and won against species that made humanity look like children playing at soldiers. A Vorkai general named High Commander Drathok stood before his officers and told them plainly. Earth was angry. Anger made species reckless. Reckless enemies made mistakes. They would come out fast and hard, burn bright, and fall apart when they hit the first real resistance. It had happened before. It would happen again. He was not afraid. But in the council chamber, something was changing. The delegates who had spoken so confidently about reparations and peaceful resolution were now much quieter. The sensor data was still coming in, and it kept getting bigger. Not just the ships, the speed of mobilization. Earth had gone from a civilian government to a full war footing in less than 4 days. No civilization in the Concord had ever done that. Not even the Vorkai, at the height of their expansion, had moved that fast. Ambassador Yireth of the Yelthari sat in his chair and watched the data scroll across his screen. He had lived through 3 major galactic conflicts. He had studied dozens more. He knew what it looked like when a civilization fought because it had to. He also knew what it looked like when a civilization fought because something deep and fundamental inside it had been broken open. He had heard the names. He had listened from beginning to end. He thought about Sarah Voss walking out of the council chamber 3 days ago. The quiet in her eyes. Not defeat, not grief. Something much colder and much more focused than either of those things. He pulled up the most recent Earth transmission on his screen and read it again. Short. No threats. No anger. No drama. We will not be sending diplomats. He set the screen down and looked out at the stars. For the first time in a very long time, Ambassador Yireth felt something he had almost forgotten the name of. He felt afraid. Not for himself. For the Vorkai. They still did not understand what they had done. They had looked at humanity and seen a small, young, emotional species that would break under pressure. They had not looked at what that species had survived to get here. They had not considered what 4,700,000 names sounded like when spoken one by one over 11 hours. The fleet was moving, and somewhere out among the stars, the galaxy held its breath. Everyone in the galaxy expected Earth to go straight for the Vorkai homeworld. That was what an angry civilization did. That was the obvious move. You hit the enemy where they lived. You showed them what it felt like. It was emotional, it was predictable, and the Vorkai were ready for it. Earth did not do the obvious thing. Admiral Sarah Voss had not gone back into politics to be a diplomat. She had gone into politics because she believed that words and calm could solve most problems. She had spent 10 years believing that. The attack on the colonies had not broken that belief. It had simply made her understand that there were some problems that words would never solve, and that this was one of them. When she left the council chamber, she had gone straight to a secure communication room and spent the next 18 hours on calls with Earth's War Command and the commanders of the Sol Armada. The plan they built together was not about anger. It was about precision. The Sol Armada split into 9 groups the moment it crossed into Vorkai space. Each group had a specific target. None of the targets were the Vorkai homeworld. None of them were even close to it. Instead, Earth went after everything that kept the Vorkai Empire running from the outside in. Every supply station, every forward base, every refueling depot along the outer edges of their territory, every Allied outpost that had provided logistical support for the attack on the human colonies. In 17 days, humanity dismantled the entire outer shell of the Vorkai Empire. It was not a clean, painless campaign. Humans took losses, ships were destroyed, soldiers died. The Vorkai fought hard, and in several engagements they came close to turning the tide. But every time they tried a new tactic, a flanking maneuver, a concentrated attack on a single human ship group, a retreat designed to draw the fleet into a trap, the humans adapted. Not slowly, not after taking heavy losses and retreating to reconsider. They adapted mid-battle, in real time, with a speed that alien military analysts had never seen before. A Yeltari military observer named Captain Soreth had been granted special permission to monitor the conflict from a neutral observation station near the edge of Vorkai space. His job was to collect data for the Concorde's records. What he saw in those 17 days he would later describe as the most unsettling experience of his career. He had watched many wars. He had seen great civilizations fight. But he had never seen anything quite like this. "They do not fight like soldiers following a plan," he wrote in one of his reports. "They fight like water finding its way through stone. Every time a wall goes up, they find a crack. Every time a door closes, they go through a window. They are never surprised for long. They are never confused for long. It is as if each individual unit carries the intelligence of the whole fleet inside it, and the moment something changes, everything adjusts at once." The Vorkai commanders on the front lines began to feel something they were not accustomed to feeling. They had fought many enemies. They had won many battles. But in those battles, the pattern had always been the same. Attack, resist, adjust, overpower. It was a known rhythm. War was a known rhythm. What the humans were doing did not have a rhythm. It was constant, relentless, and it never gave them a moment to settle. Then came the Battle of Kethorum Station. Kethorum was not a typical military base. It was one of the oldest and most heavily defended structures in the Vorkai Empire. A massive, rotating battle station that had been built into a hollowed-out asteroid more than 2,000 years ago. It had never been successfully attacked in all that time. Its defenses were layered deep. Its weapons could target and destroy incoming ships before they got within firing range. Its hull was meters thick. Inside it lived 80,000 Vorkai soldiers and crew, along with all the systems needed to keep the Outer Empire's eastern flank operational. The Vorkai High Command had expected Earth to try to attack it directly. They had reinforced its weapons systems and stationed additional ships nearby. They were confident that any assault on Kethorum would be broken apart long before it reached the station itself. Earth did not attack Kethorum directly. A small group of human ships spent 3 days in a distant sector doing what appeared to be routine navigation. What they were actually doing was making very careful measurements of a large asteroid moving through a slow orbit about 2 million kilometers away from the station. When the math was exactly right, they used a combination of tractor systems and a series of precisely timed engine bursts to shift the asteroid's path by a fraction of a degree. That fraction of a degree, calculated across 2 million kilometers, produced a very different result at the other end. The station's sensors detected the asteroid 11 minutes before impact. They tried to alter its path with weapons fire. They called for emergency evacuation. 11 minutes was not enough time. Kethorum Station ceased to exist in 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The news traveled across the galaxy in hours. Galactic news networks that had been running updates every few hours now went to continuous coverage. Military analysts who had been confidently making predictions about the conflict stopped making predictions. The comment sections of Concord public forums, normally full of opinions and debate, went unusually quiet. In the council chamber, no one was talking about reparations anymore. 2 Yelthari delegates were overheard speaking quietly near the back of the chamber. One of them said, "They did not shoot it down. They did not blast through the walls. They moved a rock." The other said nothing for a moment. Then, "They are not fighting like soldiers. They are fighting like something that has been patient for a very long time and finally decided it was done being patient." On Vor Prime, High Commander Drath Ock sat in his war room and looked at the updated maps. His outer empire was gone. His supply lines were cut. His allied stations had been taken out with what now seemed like uncomfortable ease. He had not expected this. None of them had expected this. He still believed they could stop Earth at the homeworld. The Sol Armada was powerful, yes, but Vor Prime had the most advanced planetary defense grid in the sector. It had survived attacks from enemies far older than humanity. It was still a winnable war. The math still said it was possible. He told his officers this. They believed him. They went back to their stations and prepared. But somewhere in a quiet office on Earth's War Command Station, a team of analysts was already looking at Vor Prime's defense grid. They were measuring, calculating. They were patient people. They had learned patience from a very long and difficult history. They were not in a hurry. They had not been in a hurry for 4,700,000 reasons. And they were almost done. Vor Prime was a dark, dry world. Its cities were carved from black rock and rose in sharp, angular towers against a pale orange sky. It had been the heart of the Vorkai Empire for 6,000 years. It had weathered storms, political upheaval, and the slow turning of galactic history without once being threatened by an outside force. The Vorkai were proud of this. Their homeworld was not just a planet. It was a symbol of everything their civilization had become: strong, calculating, and untouchable. The Sol Armada arrived on the 26th day after the attack on the human colonies. It came out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that covered more sky than any Vorkai sensor operator had ever seen. Not one fleet, not two, all 9 groups, reunited, moving together in a shape that looked almost deliberate. A wide, curved line that positioned itself between Vor Prime and its 2 moons, cutting off every retreat route at once. The planet's defense grid came online within seconds. Alarms rang across every city. The Vorkai warfleet, stationed in orbit and in the system's outer reaches, moved to engage. They had more ships than most civilizations had ever faced in a single battle. Their weapons were some of the most advanced in the sector. High Commander Drath Ock stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the human fleet come, and he told himself the numbers still held. They were ready. This was their ground. This was what they had built their empire to defend. The battle lasted 6 hours. It would be inaccurate to call it a one-sided fight. The Vorkai made Earth pay for every advance. 300 human ships were destroyed in the first 2 hours alone. Sections of the Sol Armada took heavy damage. Soldiers died in the cold dark between the stars, in numbers that would fill monuments for years to come. The Vorkai gave everything they had. But Earth gave more. The human fleet did not fight in a straight line. It did not charge and absorb punishment and push through. It moved like something alive, constantly shifting, constantly finding the angles the Vorkai defense hadn't fully covered. When the Vorkai concentrated their fire on one section of the human line, that section pulled back slightly, while 2 other sections moved forward on the flanks. When the Vorkai tried to retreat to draw the humans into the planetary defense grid's range, the Sol Armada simply stopped following, and waited, until the Vorkai had to come back out. By the 4th hour, the Vorkai fleet had lost more than half its ships. By the 5th hour, the flagship's bridge crew were sending emergency messages to the High Command on the surface below. By the 6th hour, the last Vorkai warship had gone dark. The Sol Armada held position in orbit above NovaPrime. Their weapons were charged, their targeting systems were locked. Below them, a civilization of billions watched from the surface and waited for what came next. What came next was not what anyone expected. Sarah Voss opened a communication channel, not to the Vorkai government, not to the Vorkai military. She opened it to every frequency simultaneously, every channel that carried a signal in the galactic concord. Every ship, every station, every colony, every world that could receive a broadcast received it. She wanted every civilization in the galaxy to hear what she was about to say, and to understand that she was saying it while 14,000 warships sat in orbit above the enemy homeworld. Her voice was calm. It always was. She said that Earth had not come to NovaPrime to destroy it. She said that humanity did not make war on civilians, and that the people of NovaPrime who had not ordered the attack on the human colonies were not her target. She said that there were 3 things Earth required, and that these things were not a negotiation. They were terms. The first term was the surrender of Emperor Vethkar and all members of the High Command who had authorized the attack. They were to be handed over for trial under Galactic Concord law. The second term was the complete dismantling of all Vorkai offensive war assets, to be carried out under the direct supervision of Earth's military, which would remain in the system until the process was verified and complete. The third term was this: a monument was to be built on the surface of NovaPrime, in the center of its largest city, in a place where it could never be missed or forgotten. On that monument, every one of the 4,700,000 human names was to be inscribed, permanently. It was to be maintained in perpetuity. No government, no future emperor, no future generation was to be permitted to remove it, or cover it, or let it fall into disrepair. These are Earth's terms, Sarah Voss said. We will not be offering them twice. There was silence on the Vorkai end of the channel for 47 seconds. Then a voice, thin, shaking slightly, came back. It was a junior communications officer. He said the High Command was deliberating. Voss said nothing. She simply waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Word reached the Sol Armada that the Vorkai were debating the terms. Some on the surface were apparently still arguing that the planetary shields could hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Reinforcements that did not exist, from an outer empire that no longer existed. Sarah Voss looked at the targeting display in front of her. She selected NovaPrime's main planetary shield generator, a single facility on the northern continent, located far from any population center. She gave a quiet order. 1 human cruiser fired once. The shield generator went dark. No civilians were harmed. The shot was so precise, so surgical, that the surrounding buildings did not even lose power. On the planet below, every Vorkai who had been watching their defense screens saw the same thing at the same time. Their shields were gone, and the humans had done it with a single shot, from a single ship, while the rest of the fleet simply watched. Emperor Vethkar surrendered 11 minutes later. In the council chamber on Velhora Prime, the news arrived in real time. The delegates had been watching the battle data on their screens. Most of them had been sitting without speaking for several hours. When the surrender was confirmed, nobody cheered. Nobody said anything at all. The chamber was absolutely silent. 9 minutes passed. Not a single delegate broke the silence. They sat with the weight of what they had witnessed, and nobody had the right words, because there were no right words for what they had just seen. Ambassador Yereth of the Yelthari looked at the seat where Sarah Voss had sat 11 days ago, before she walked out. The empty chair looked different to him now. Everything looked a little different now. In the weeks that followed the fall of Vor Prime, the galaxy tried to make sense of what had happened. Scholars pulled out their records. Military analysts rebuilt the timeline. Historians who specialized in galactic conflicts sat down with the data and went through it step by step. What they found did not make them feel better. Humanity had gone from a minor council seat to the most feared military force in the known galaxy in 26 days. Not because Earth got lucky. Not because the Vorkai made one mistake that turned the whole thing around. The calculations had been wrong from the very beginning. Every assumption that had made the attack seem safe, that Earth's fleet was small, that humans were emotionally unstable fighters, that no one would back them, every single one of those assumptions had been incorrect. A Vorkai military historian named Scholar General Ozkveth, who had survived the war, and was now part of the surrender proceedings, was asked to write an official analysis of what had gone wrong. He spent 3 months on it. The document ran to several hundred pages, but the conclusion was simple enough to fit in a single paragraph. He wrote, "We studied Earth's military records. We counted their ships. We assessed their technology. We did not study what kind of species built those ships. We did not ask how a civilization survives 10,000 years of conflict on a single planet with limited resources and no outside help. We did not ask what that history produces in the people who carry it. We assumed that because they were young in space, they were young in war. They were not. Across the Concord, civilizations that had never paid much attention to Earth began paying very close attention. Within a month of the surrender, 17 different governments opened direct diplomatic channels with Earth. They were polite, extremely polite. They sent gifts, they sent compliments. They referenced long-standing friendship and shared values, most of which had not been mentioned before the Battle of Vor Prime. Sarah Voss received each one with the same calm expression she always wore, said thank you, and passed them on to her staff. She was not naive. She knew that politeness born from fear was not the same as genuine friendship. She knew that some of these civilizations were reaching out because they wanted to be on Earth's good side, not because they had suddenly discovered a great love for humanity. She accepted this. That was how the galaxy worked. You earned your place, not always through kindness, but through being impossible to ignore. Earth had become impossible to ignore. The monument went up on Vor Prime 14 months after the surrender. It stood in the center of the capital city, built from white stone that had been chosen specifically because it stood out against the dark rock of the planet's surface. The names were carved in small, careful letters, all 4,700,000 of them, arranged in columns that wrapped around all 4 sides of a tall, wide pillar. Earth sent no delegation to the opening. No ceremony was requested. The monument simply appeared, and it stood there in the middle of the Vorkai city, and every day, the people who passed it could read the names of the humans who had died when their empire decided the math said it was safe to kill them. Back on Earth and her colonies, the aftermath of the war was a complicated thing. There was pride, there was grief, there was the long, slow work of rebuilding Kepler-7 and New Carthage and Dreven's Rest. 4,700,000 people were gone, and no victory changed that. The families of those people rebuilt their lives. Their children grew up in new homes on worlds that were being slowly put back together. The weight of the loss did not disappear. It settled into the culture the way old grief always does, not as a wound that healed, but as a scar that became part of who they were. Captain Sorith, the Yelthari military observer who had watched the campaign from this neutral station, published his full report to the Concorde's academic records 6 months after the war ended. It became one of the most widely read documents in the Concorde's history. In it, he described everything he had seen: the speed of mobilization, the precision of the strikes, the adaptation in battle, the 11 hours of names. He ended the report with a personal note that was, strictly speaking, outside the boundaries of an official military analysis. His superiors chose to leave it in. He wrote, "I have spent my career believing that I understood war. I have watched the great powers fight. I have measured fleets and counted weapons and estimated outcomes. What I saw in those 26 days has changed the way I think about all of it." The Vorkai were not weak. They were not foolish. They made a rational calculation with the information they had. What they lacked was the right information. They did not know, none of us knew, that beneath the surface of this young civilization lived something very old, something shaped by every war they ever fought, and every disaster they ever survived, and every time they had to start over from nothing. Humans are not frightening because of their weapons. They are frightening because of what produced their weapons. And I suspect they always will be. Ambassador Yerith of the Yelthari retired from the council 2 years after the war. In his final address to the chamber, he said very little. He thanked his colleagues. He spoke briefly about the future of the Concorde. And then he said one last thing, quietly, before he sat down. "We made a mistake that many civilizations have made before us. We saw young people and assumed that young meant soft. We did not look at their history. We did not look at their scars. We did not ask ourselves how a species that had been through what they had been through managed to arrive at our table, still standing. We know the answer now. I hope we do not need to learn it again." On the rebuilt colony of New Carthage, a girl of about 8 years old stood in the yard of her family's home in the early evening and looked up at the sky. The stars were coming out. One of them, if you knew where to look, was the sun that lit NovaPrime's surface every morning. Her father came and stood beside her. He was a soldier, though he did not look like one anymore. He looked like a man who had carried something heavy for a long time and was only slowly beginning to set it down. She pointed at the sky and asked him what it had been like. She had been too small to understand it when it happened. She had only heard the stories. He looked at the stars for a while before he answered. He thought about the ships. He thought about the cold dark between worlds. He thought about the friends he had lost and the ones he had brought home. He thought about 11 hours of names. "They thought we'd beg," he said. She looked up at him. "What did we do instead?" He put a hand on her shoulder. The evening was quiet. The stars were bright. Somewhere far away, on a dark world made of black rock under a pale orange sky, a white monument stood in the heart of a city, and names covered every side of it from ground to top, and they would still be there long after everyone who had known this moment was gone. He looked at the sky for a long time. "We made sure," he said, "that they would never forget the answer."